let's start like this. You cannot do metaphysics without making a few enemies. So to refer to the philosophers covered so far, Deleuze and Guattari certainly had their enemies. Famously, one of them was, or perhaps still is, Alain Badiou, who accused their philosophy of being a pre-fascist ideology. Badiou held that positing an ontology of machines that operate among themselves without any transcendent factor regulating those operations dramatically increases our need for such a factor. So for Badiou, seeing the world as a creative mass of multiplicities will irrevocably strengthen the call for a state, with capital S, to bring order to all that chaos. And the ontology of machines could therefore be revealed as secretly desiring bourgeois unity and state hegemony, or at least so Badiou thinks. As for Latour, his enemies come in two flavors. On the one hand, he is frequently accused of being a relativist who reduces science to politics. This is because many who read Latour wrongly conclude that he holds that whatever an actor is simply depends on what humans decide it to be. On the other hand, Latour is accused of being a reactionary who reduces politics to science. Latour holds that the detailed descriptions of actors and networks can show how seemingly monolithic forces of domination, capital with a large C, are in fact always composed of chains of individually weak actors that can be altered or broken. His critics, however, hold that such an emphasis on descriptive work forever postpones or even disregards real political interventions, real structural power inequalities, and so on, in favor of never-ending series of reports, thus substituting social science for political activism. Graham Harman, whose ontology is the focus of tonight's lecture, also has his fair share of enemies. One notable critic has been Ray Brazier, who, together with Graham Harman, Quentin Meillassoux, and Ian Hamilton Grant, is one of the four original so-called speculative realists that did much to reignite the interest in metaphysics in continental philosophy in recent years, almost recent decades. Some of the major problems that Brazier and like-minded critics, such as Peter Wolfendale, have with Harman's work concern epistemological issues. Their accusation is that Harman's ontology makes any kind of claim to scientific objectivity or truth impossible, hence throwing us to the wolves of idealism or relativism, despite object-oriented ontology's promise of constituting a full-blown realism. And that gives me a nice way of structuring the talk for tonight. First, I'll briefly detail the kind of idealism or relativism that speculative realists take issue with, namely what they call correlationism. Second, I discuss some of the major features of Harman's object-oriented ontology. Third, and finally, I'll try to assess that accusation of relativism about Harman's work, which, if true, would mean that his ontology ends up reinforcing the very position that it aims to get away from. And as a small spoiler for how this is going to end, let me say that my views on the matter are likely to leave Harman's foes as well as his friends all rather unsatisfied. But hey. So our story starts with correlationism, a term coined by Meillassoux in his marvelous book After Finitude. Correlationism is the idea that we can only ever access the correlation between thinking and being, never either term considered apart from the other. To be a correlationist is therefore to hold, at the very least, two things. First, that you can never access entities in the world such as they are, because we, as observers, are always on the scene in our observations of entities. Hence, we can only ever access what we could call our own interpretations of the world, of entities, never entities such as they are. Second, it is to hold that insofar as you yourself are a thinking being, you can never access yourself such as it is. Because to think is always to think about something, always to think something, never simply to think as such, thinking as some kind of empty formal act. Hence, while we can experience specific acts of thinking about this or that, we can never experience thought as such. So for the correlationist, we only ever experience correlations, which is to say relations between thinking and being, between subjects and objects, between humans and world. Such correlationism initially is just an epistemological claim about the nature of our cognition, but it tends to become ontologized into a metaphysical position about what the world is ultimately like. And the most famous example of that is the progression you see from Kant to Hegel, right? Recall that for Kant, everything we experience is the result of synthetic activities carried out by the transcendental subject. Briefly put, carried out by the mind, where we never experience things in and of themselves, Kant's famous Dinge an sich, which do not appear in space and time and are therefore excluded from the realm of possible experience. So basically you can think about them, but you cannot know or experience them. For Hegel, however, to posit something that exists beyond human experience is a contradictory act. To posit something is, after all, a cognitive and therefore experiential act. Hence the mental act of positing an entity that would have nothing to do with the act of you positing it. For Hegel is not much different from saying that you are thinking about a unicorn that you are not thinking about. Hegel therefore concludes that any talk of a Ding an sich, a thing in itself, cannot refer to something apart from your experience, leading him to simply abolish the whole notion of things that would exist really independently of human minds. So here we see a correlationism sliding from an epistemological idea into a metaphysical theory. Now, what's so problematic about correlationism that each of the four original speculative realists, Razier, Harman, Grant, and Mayassu, take issue with it? Well, what I'd like to mention here is what one of the major problems is according to Mayassu, namely that correlationism facilitates or engenders what he calls fideism. And fideism is the idea that statements can only be evaluated in terms of their contingent political or moral standing, never simply in terms of are they true or false. So for a fideist, if you are a fideist, then you think that there are perhaps historical, political, or moral truths, but never truths plain and simple, right? And if that is the case, Mayassu worries, then no impartial arbitration is ever possible whenever incommensurable claims to truth about reality are made. Now that should do to introduce the general idea of correlationism. So let's move to the second part, Graham Harman's object-oriented ontology. And then in the third part, we'll come back to correlationism. In his first book, Tool Being, Harman develops the foundational insights of what will then still become object-oriented ontology from an unorthodox reading of Martin Heidegger's famous tool analysis. Recall that according to Heidegger, when a tool such as a hammer happens to break, something interesting is revealed. That's an opportunity to realize something interesting, because at such an occasion, we can notice that all of our tools are usually integrated into a larger system of equipment that does not demand much conscious attention, right? So probably up till now, nobody in the room was consciously paying attention to the air conditioning, because the air conditioning is tied to various other kinds of equipment such that it remains functioning in the background without us having to focus on it. But when a tool breaks, its relation with that system is suddenly interrupted or severed, and it starts to demand our conscious attention, right? So imagine the air conditioning breaking down and starting to make a high-pitched whining noise such that you cannot, ignore it. One orthodox reading, or one mainstream reading, of the tool analysis takes it to demonstrate that objects have two modes of existing, even though that's not Heidegger's terminology. One practical or ready to hand, as when we readily use a tool as a functional part of a wider system of equipment. And one theoretical or present at hand, as when we are presented with an object that requires intellectual analysis, such as when you try to figure out how to fix a broken smartphone or a malfunctioning air condition. And Harman wants us to take this reading of the tool analysis one step further. A broken object does not just show that it has two possible relational modes of existence, one with other pieces of equipment and one with us inquisitive humans. It shows us that the object itself cannot be reduced to either of these modes nor even to both. The object can undergo the severing of old relations, the forging of new relations, and, in cases of repair, the reactivation of those old relations, all the while retaining its identity as this rather than that object, which indicates that objects are more than their relations. So beyond a phenomenology of the practical and intellectual use of objects, this, Harman thinks, opens up to an ontology of objects. However, the tool analysis is ultimately just a thought experiment that indicates that there might be more to objects than just their relations with others. The arguments as to why this is actually also the case are found elsewhere, namely in Harman's objections against what he calls overmining and undermining. To undermine an object is to reduce it to something that produces it, to something presumably more real, such that the object in question turns out to just be a representation of or a sign of that deeper reality. So pre-Socratic philosophies, according to which all is really water or fire, are typical undermining positions. And the same is true for contemporary forms of naturalism, according to which all that exists is just subatomic particles, snares, fields, or what have you. Deleuze's metaphysics, or Deleuze's early metaphysics, that held all of our actual reality to be the product of a virtual underlying dimension, is also a clear undermining position. Now, can objects be undermined? Can that be your metaphysics? Can all objects be undermined? Not according to Harman, as undermining positions would be unable to account for emergent properties. Water has properties that hydrogen and oxygen do not have, for example. So even if the properties of hydrogen and oxygen fully suffice to explain why water has its particular properties, water itself must still exist, of course, in order to be the bearer of those particular properties. And to this, we can add that undermining positions have a hard time dealing with the idea of redundant causation, which is the idea that varying arrangements of parts can produce and reproduce the exact same object. So if I lose a few hairs or gain some muscle mass, I do not thereby become another entity, just like a house remains the same entity when a few bricks or beams are replaced. Numerous different causes can yield the same object, which testifies to the notion that an object is somewhat more than the parts from which it is generated. There is ontological wiggle room there. And for Harman, this suffices to discount undermining. Next, to overmine an object is to reduce it to its actions or its effects on others. If we recall that Latour defined actors in terms of what they modify, transform, perturb, or create, we see that a good part of actor network theory is an overmining position. Many pragmatist positions also tend towards an overmining view of the world, as they tend to argue that it's rather pointless to speculate about what objects themselves ultimately are, and that we are better off simply treating them in terms of what they do to human and non-human others. And the same goes for functionalist positions that argue that entities simply are the way they appear or function within a larger whole. For example, in analytical philosophy, functionalism is the idea that what makes something a thought, for instance, does not rely on its internal constitution, but exclusively on the role that it plays in a cognitive system. So, can objects be overmined? They cannot, Harman holds, because overmining positions cannot account for change. If objects are nothing but their effects on others, then by definition they are nothing but the current sum of ways in which they are experienced by or connected to others, full stop. And to illustrate that with an example, put your hand on a flat surface and then imagine that your hand would be nothing but the contact that it makes with that surface. And in addition, imagine that the muscles, nerves, bones, and tendons in your hand are also nothing but the current contact they make with other parts of your hand. In such a situation, how could your hand ever move? It could not, because your hand and all its parts would be nothing but their current connections, which is to say their current positions. So change to your hand would have to come from somewhere else, perhaps from further up your arm, or your nervous system, or your brain, and so on. But if all of your other body parts, and by extension the rest of the world as well, are also nothing but their current connections, their current deployment, then they too could never bring about change. And this is enough for Harman to conclude that the being of entities cannot be overmined either. So undermining and overmining both fail as ontological positions. Harman does of course not deny that objects have parts by virtue of which they exist, nor does he deny that objects have effects on other entities. He simply denies that parts and effects are all that objects are. Objects must be more than that. There must be a real aspect to them that is irreducible to their parts and effects. Yet instead of irreducibility, Harman prefers to use the term withdrawal. Every real object withdraws from its relational engagements with others, whether they are its parts or its environment. As with Deleuze, this gives us two levels at which objects are to be found, only Harman does not use the same terminology as Deleuze, because why would he? Where Deleuze speaks of bodies, bodies without organs, with their powers, and partial objects with their qualities, Harman distinguishes between the real object, which is the thing in itself, withdrawn from relations, and the sensual object, which is the thing insofar as other entities encounter it in relations. Yet, Harman's objects are not simple twofolds, but fourfolds, hence the title of one of his books, The Quadruple Object. Real objects and sensual objects must be supplemented with two further aspects for simple reasons. First simple reason. Relations to objects, so relations with what Harman calls sensual objects, are never relations with bare particulars, right? You never encounter an object plain and simple without any specific features. Every object of experience is endowed with specific properties. Hence, in addition to sensual objects, there must be sensual qualities. Each apple must have a color, each rock must have a weight, each sound must have a frequency, and so on. Second, real objects, so objects in and of themselves, must also have specific properties. This is already noted by Leibniz in the Monadology, when he stresses that each monad must have particular properties, as otherwise all monads would be completely identical to one another. Hence, each real object must also be endowed with particular real qualities to make it this rather than that real entity. And this gives you Harman's fourfold model of entities. Real objects have real qualities, and together these comprise a withdrawn essence. In turn, sensual objects have sensual qualities, together constituting the surface part of a reality available to others. And despite this schematic nature of the object, this fourfold ontology is far from static. It is rather a system of perpetual tensions. Why? Well, because no object, no real object, necessarily manifests as this rather than that sensual object. Well, a statue is a different sensual object for a viewer who sees it from afar than it is for a person who is blind and hence is touching it. No sensual object necessarily needs to have particular qualities, right? A person that you love may become a person that you hate over the course of a single conversation, if things really go south. No real qualities are necessarily part of a real object even, and no real object necessarily exists, in the sense that all real objects and their qualities must be produced by other entities rather than existing automatically. Now, given Harman's emphasis on the withdrawal of real entities from their relational engagements with others, one obvious question is how object-oriented ontology accounts for change. After all, one of the main motivations for Harman developing his ontology is this idea that undermining and overmining positions cannot properly account for change themselves. In the case of undermining positions, that concerned change in the sense of new properties emerging. In the case of overmining positions, it concerns any event whatsoever being able to take place. Now, when looking at how object-oriented ontology accounts for change, it is crucial that the idea of withdrawal, the withdrawn objects, is understood properly. Some commentators have understood this idea as meaning that a real object and its real qualities, so this essence, are completely isolated from the rest of reality. If that were the case, then object-oriented ontology obviously could never account for real change, since something cannot be reached. Since something that cannot be reached by anything else cannot alter. You might, of course, still claim that it is its own engine of alteration in some sense, but again, if such an object would be completely isolated from anything else in reality, such an engine would not make the slightest difference for the rest of the world. But fortunately, withdrawal emphatically does not mean that a real object is completely isolated from everything else. Withdrawal, in Harman's sense, only means that real objects and real qualities are never manifestly present to other entities. Whenever a human or non-human is related to by another entity of whatever kind, then what that second entity registers or experiences or encounters is a sensual object with sensual qualities, not the real object and its real qualities. But here it is important to note that this is a unilateral affair, right? So from the fact that a real object cannot directly affect any other entity, it does not follow that a real object cannot be affected by any other entity. So in object-oriented ontology, the object, the thing, that registers sensual objects and sensual qualities is not itself yet another sensual object. Because if that were the case, it would commit us to holding that when I see you, then the entity doing the seeing is identical to myself as I appear to someone else's vision, right, in someone else's field of vision. You would have to hold that that to which something appears is yet another appearance, which is absurd. So sensual objects do not produce or even register each other. What produces or registers a sensual object is always a real object with its real qualities. When I see you, the entity doing the seeing is me qua real object. Or when two planes crash into each other, to use one of Harman's less charming examples, this event concerns not one reciprocal relation, but rather a set of at least two unilateral relations. Plane A qua real object is affected by plane B qua manifest sensual object, and conversely, but in another relation, plane B qua real object is affected by plane A qua sensual object. And the lesson to take from that is that all real objects are fundamentally open to a world full of sensual objects. Of course, no single real object is open to all sensual objects because real objects have real qualities that must by necessity determine what they can and cannot be affected by, and to what degree and with which intensity and so on. And this openness allows object-oriented ontology to account for real change, which is to say, for alterations to the essences of objects. Right? And this differentiates it from more classical positions, in which an essence was always taken as something that would be unchanging, right? It could not alter, and especially not due to events in the world. And note that without such an account of change, so the ability for an essence, for a real object to alter, Harman's position would indeed not be very different from a Platonic idealism. Instead of eternal and unchanging forms, of which everything that happens in reality would just be a simulacrum, we would have eternal and unchanging objects, of which everything that happens in reality would just be a sensual representation. In any case, Harman accounts for real change in terms of what he calls symbiosis, a term that he adopts and adapts from Lynn Margulis's work on evolutionary biology. Harman's idea of symbiosis is this. Most changes that occur around an object, so most changes that occur around you as an object, are trivial. Even though they make for a certain difference in the world, they are not significant enough to cause real change to the essence of an object. Most of the things that happen around us or to us are just the surface plane of sensual objects and their sensual qualities. So for example, if you take a walk around campus here, all kinds of buildings and people will slide in and out your field of vision. These are sensual objects, and their qualities change as you observe them from different angles as you keep walking. None of these events necessarily implies real change to the very being of any of the objects involved. No building changes its very nature by the mere fact of you entering it. No student becomes a completely different person because you pass them in a hallway, no matter, how important you think you are as a scholar. Nor do you become a different person because you run into a student while entering a building. In other words, real change, change that alters you, that really transforms you qua real object, seems to be rare. And to distinguish real change from the masses of trivial changes that merely play out on the sensual level, that are merely superficial, Harman uses this term symbiosis compared to the ubiquity of trivial events. Any given object will only ever undergo a relatively small number of symbiotic changes that truly transform it. Harman sometimes speculates that the amount of possible symbiotic changes might be around 5 or 6 for any given object, but the exact number is of course not really relevant, because even 100 symbiotic changes over the course of the existence of a single object is still a very, very small number in comparison to the countless sensual events that most objects are implicated in on a daily basis. However, the question now becomes, why would symbiotic change be rare? Why is it rare for an object to change profoundly in an encounter with something else? Why do I, for example, not undergo major changes, major transformations to who and what I am several times per day? Here's the intuitive answer. It's also the wrong one. The intuitive answer would be real objects, these real objects that object-oriented ontology talks about, are usually shielded from the rest of reality by those sensual appearances, those sensual objects that envelop them, that you can never quite pierce. But at rare occasions, something somehow manages to bypass or penetrate that envelope and strike at the very heart of a real object. So let's call that the Death Star model of change. As you know, in Star Wars, the only way to destroy the first Death Star, rather than just inflict superficial damage, was to shoot some proton torpedoes down the one unprotected thermal exhaust port. So the Death Star model of change is somewhat intuitive because it accords with some of the ways in which we usually talk about truly transformative change, right? You can be in a crowded bar and you can be rather unperturbed by all of the other patrons for the entire night until you have an unexpected encounter with that one person who somehow bypasses all your defenses, sets your heart ablaze, and makes you fall deeply in love. They are your proton torpedo. Or you can be an aspiring athlete who clearly has real talent, but you always keep hitting some kind of ceiling that prevents you from truly excelling. One day, however, something happens, you have a conversation, you read a certain book, or you have a training session that's somehow different from all the other ones, and something just clicks deep inside you. That was, again, your proton torpedo, and it marks the point where you finally transform into a truly amazing athlete. The Death Star model of change is attractive because it is nicely dramatic, romantic even, but it's also wrong, and here's why. Earlier on, we established that even though real objects, so these essential things, can never be experienced directly, because what you experience of a real object is always just its sensual profiles, they are always completely open to sensual objects that they themselves experience. So first of all, there are no exceptions to the envelopment of real objects by sensual objects in their relations with others. No thermal exhaust ports that you can shoot proton torpedoes through. But second of all, that full envelopment is irrelevant when we try to account for change, because when we consider real change in object-oriented ontology, so transformative essential change, we are not talking about how the real object that changes is registered by others, but about how that real object registers others. And since real objects are fully open to the outside world, the question of why real change is not extremely common still stands. If you, qua real object, are fully open to being affected by sensual objects around you, then why does not every person in the bar transform your very being? Why don't you fall in love with everyone? If you are so open to the world, then why does not every attempt to learn something, whether it's a sport, a scientific discipline, or just how to cook well, expose you to new elements that rock you to your very core? The answer to the question is that a real object and its real qualities do not just constitute who you really are or what any object really is, but also what you are and are not receptive to, and to which degree and with which intensity that is the case. By analogy, just like the quality of blindness makes it so that a blind person cannot perceive colors, the real qualities of an object make it so that most of the world around it will not be able to perturb it. So according to Harman, the symbiotic events that an object endures will make it increasingly path-dependent, which will increasingly limit the probability of yet another symbiotic event occurring. In sum, what regulates real change in object-oriented ontology is not the envelope of sensual objects around a real object, but rather the structure or topology of a real object and its real qualities itself. All right. So that's the fourfold. That's how the fourfold accounts for change. And with that said, we have covered some of the basics of Harman's object-oriented ontology. And we now move to the final part of the talk, which concerns how object-oriented ontology deals with concerns about correlationism, so what we discussed earlier. To start, there is an obvious, clear sense in which object-oriented ontology goes beyond correlationism. Recall that for the correlationist, human cognition can only ever access the relation between human and world, between thinking and being. Object-oriented ontology goes beyond that relation by theorizing what the ontological structure of entities must necessarily be, completely independent of whether or not we human beings are on the scene to deal with those entities. Right? So Harman's fourfold structure of objects is not a correlationist property of how human beings happen to experience objects, but rather a property of objects in and of themselves. Second, Object-oriented ontology generalizes or universalizes the correlate, in that it shows how finitude is not a tragic flaw that only human beings have to deal with, but rather a constitutive feature of the relation between any two objects, be they human or non-human. No object ever directly accesses the very being of another entity, as all objects only ever experience the sensual presentations and associated sensual qualities that envelop real objects. And here it's worth noting how Mayasu has criticized Harman's ontology for being what Mayasu calls a case of subjectalism. To be a subjectalist, in Mayasu's sense, is to take some feature of how we humans happen to experience the world and to project that feature onto all existing entities and also their engagements with each other whenever we are not on the scene. So according to Mayasu, what happens, what you see happen in Harman's philosophy, is that one specific feature of human contact with the world, namely the fact that the very being of objects around us remains withdrawn from us, such that we only ever see their appearances, their sensual profiles, is isolated and projected onto all of reality. And I wanted to address that point of critique because it's a little disingenuous. It makes it sound as if Harman just picked a random feature of human experience that he happened to like, and then simply decided by fiat that all non-humans also have that feature, but that's of course not what happens in object-oriented ontology. What happens is that the necessity of withdrawal is deduced from the fact that overmining and undermining entities is shown to be impossible. So to call object-oriented ontology a subjectalist theory is to disregard that, just like, incidentally, Mayasu's own speculative materialist position, that we are not discussing tonight, it does not arrive at its posits by reflecting on human experience, but by a series of conceptual deductions. Recall the earlier parts of this lecture, right? Harman's reflections on what we can learn from the tool analysis, from a tool that breaks, just lead to a certain hypothesis about what objects ultimately are. But this hypothesis is only confirmed and fleshed out in a series of ontological deductions concerning undermining and overmining. Interestingly, this does imply that much like Mayasu, Harman is committed to holding that human reason is able to surpass the correlate. Object-oriented ontology must hold that, just like any other entity, we only ever experience, phenomenologically, the sensual profiles of other things. So, how they appear and not what they are. Yet reason allows us to discern what the ontological structure of things must necessarily be over and above such sensual surfaces. After all, that's precisely what Harman's theory of fourfold objects tells us. And this brings me to Harman's critics. There is one sense in which Harman's object-oriented ontology does not surpass correlationism. It does not break the correlate in the sense that it holds that no entity ever directly accesses the real being of another entity. It tells you that real objects exist, but not which real objects exist or what their precise qualities are. In other words, object-oriented ontology cannot accommodate any version of a correspondence theory of truth according to which you or someone else could have unmediated and direct knowledge of things in themselves. And that's different from, for example, Mayasu, who argues that mathematics, or certain kinds of mathematics, are the exception that proves what is otherwise the rule, in that mathematics would allow us to make unmediated true statements about mind-independent reality in a way that's completely independent of culture, history, and so on. However, it's not so different from Razier's own position, as he also holds that no direct or unmediated access to entities from some kind of God's eye perspective is possible. Nevertheless, he defends the idea that the natural and cognitive sciences track mind-independent reality in ways that are so much more reliable and informative than any other kind of human activity, that you could basically call the hard sciences different in kind from all of our other practices. And that would be Brazier's answer to the problem of fideism, which, as you recall, is the problem that in a world where correlationism would be the only game in town, it would be impossible to determine what is true when incommensurable claims are made. It would only be possible to determine what is politically or morally more feasible in the eyes of a certain specific group of people. For Brazier, the natural and cognitive sciences are what allows us, or what will allow us, to cut Gordian knots whenever there is disagreement about what reality is or is not. The question then is how this kind of epistemological concern pans out in Harman's object-oriented ontology. As I said, this final part is very unlikely to completely satisfy either friends or foes or object-oriented ontology, which is ironic because I count myself as one of the friends. But nevertheless, I personally think along the following lines. First, it's worth stating again that object-oriented ontology is committed to holding that reason is able to surpass the correlates. So the problem of correlationism is not as all-encompassing as it initially seems to be. This means that within the conceptual framework of object-oriented ontology, certain statements about reality can definitively be marked as objectively true or false. For example, all metaphysical theories that end up in an undermining or overmining position, or even a combination of both, are marked as objectively false. This strikes just one blow against fideism, but I think it is an important one. Just like any other decent metaphysical theory, object-oriented ontology gives us a certain conceptual bandwidth within which all potentially viable statements about mind-independent reality must necessarily be situated. Second, in a piece called Speculative Autopsy, Brazier calls it an egregious problem that object-oriented ontology cannot answer the simple question of what an object is, of what any particular object is. It gives us no way to ever say with certainty which, or even just how many real objects underlie a series of sensual objects. This, however, is a slightly disingenuous objection for at least two reasons. Reason one is that the objection plays on two different senses of the word certainty. For example, to be absolutely certain that electricity and magnetism are just two manifestations of the same underlying force, one would have to step outside of our finite bodies, theories, and laboratories, take up a God's eye perspective, and confirm that, indeed, such a single electromagnetic force exists. Since such a view from nowhere does not exist, such absolute certainty is not attainable, nor is it even desirable. It is not desirable because we can have certainty in a weaker but ultimately much more grounded sense, namely, given everything that the sciences have uncovered about the physical workings of the universe, electricity and magnetism must be two facets of the same underlying force. This underlying force is not accessed directly, but only through instruments, experiments, calculations, descriptions, and so on. Quite simply put, there is nothing in object-oriented ontology that speaks against the possibility of having this indirect kind of certainty. Reason two is that, in my view, Brazier's objection undervalues the fact that, according to object-oriented ontology, relations between a real object and its sensual manifestations are non-arbitrary. A real object can only manifest in ways that accord with its real qualities. Hence, sensual objects are not random. And as far as I can see, this is all that one needs as a condition for the possibility of the existence of practices that aim to describe the nature of things in themselves. Of course, with the caveats that even the best possible description is always still a translation of whatever real properties a thing has, given that a map is never identical to the territory it describes. And this suffices precisely because there is no reason why descriptions based on indirect observations rather than direct access could not be valid or objective. To this, I'd also add that it is not the job of the metaphysician to determine which theories count as good science that give us real knowledge, because that is a task for the sciences themselves. In other words, if I have, as a metaphysician, or just as a citizen, if I have a pet theory according to which electricity and magnetism are not facets of one underlying force, but rather mixtures of 6 different forces, then the reasons as to why I am wrong must of course come from physics, not metaphysics. So to summarize, first, object-oriented ontology already moves beyond the correlate by the very nature of its conceptual setup. Second, its inability to tell us exactly what any specific object is or is not doesn't really constitute a very serious problem. And third, if, as Brasier holds, natural science is the best game in town when it comes to knowledge of mind-independent entities, then it is up to science rather than metaphysics to demonstrate that. So again, for example, if you want to make the claim that ultimately cognitive science rather than phenomenology, for example, will allow us to properly understand the nature of our experiences, then it is up to cognitive science, obviously, to demonstrate this. The phenomenologist is, of course, likely to hold that it's not possible for the cognitive scientist to demonstrate this, because she probably holds that intentional experience is irreducible to physical states. But even then, it's still the cognitive scientist who has to show that the phenomenologist is wrong, not a metaphysician. As a final and somewhat speculative point regarding object-oriented ontology, epistemology, and correlationism, I would like to mention an idea, an attractive idea, from the Canadian philosopher of science, Ian Hacking. It is an idea that helps expand, or at least in my view, helps expand the non-absolute sense of certainty about the existence of real object that I mentioned earlier in a way that fits with object-oriented ontology. So Hacking was at some point involved with the following question. How do you know if an entity is not something that is merely theoretical? How do you know that it is real rather than just a theory? For example, nobody has ever observed the electron with the naked eye. We have theories according to which they must exist, we have calculations that tell us how they do behave, and we have models to visualize them. But how do we know that electrons are really out there in the world, and not just our ideas about the world that we came up with just so that other ideas about the world that we have seem to make more sense? Or in tonight's vocabulary, how do we know that our notions about electrons refer to real objects and not just to sensual objects? And Hacking's answer to the question comes in the form of the following slogan: if you can spray them, then they are real. And this slogan refers to an experiment in which the charge of a ball of niobium, which is a crystalline kind of metal, can be decreased by spraying it with electrons. For Hacking, this means that we are obviously dealing with a real entity rather than a theoretical entity, because a mere concept can, of course, not decrease the charge of a metal. It is, of course, always possible that future scientific work shows that electrons do not exist, for example, because our concept of them turns out to be a mixture, crude mixture, of what actually turns out to be 2 or 3 different kinds of entities. But that's besides the point. The point is that an experiment in which a real effect is registered counts as evidence of the existence of a real object. And further experiments can then always be designed to narrow down our best inferences about what that object must really be like. And this idea of if you can spray them, then they are real, is also interesting for object-oriented ontology if we recall that sensual objects, or sensual events, if you prefer, do not cause each other. Only real objects produce sensual objects, which may or may not then further alter other real objects. So as Harman puts it, sensual objects are merely contiguous, which means that they are merely proximate to each other, whereas real causation is the prerogative of real objects. In other words, if we spray electrons on a niobium ball and the charge drops, then some kind of real object must be at work, because mere appearances cannot alter appearances. Just like hacking concludes that a real rather than a theoretical entity is at work, the object-oriented ontologist must conclude that a real rather than a sensual object is at work, because the sensual, which is to say manifest, event of the charge dropping cannot be caused by another sensual object. Again, we are not thereby immediately absolutely certain that the electron exists, because we still cannot occupy a view from nowhere. But we are certain that something real exists, and through further experimentation and theorization, we can progressively refine what that real entity must be like. If sensual objects were causal agents that could affect other sensual objects, then and only then would object-oriented ontology be in real trouble when it comes to the possibility of saying anything useful about real objects and real qualities, which means when it comes to the possibility of having knowledge about mind-independent entities. But given that this is not the case, given that if you can spray them, they are real, things are not as bad as they might seem to Harman's harshest critics. Thank you very much.